has changed into wailing. My joy has fallen to gloom. I humble myself before you, Yahweh, and wait to be lifted up.
Shalom, brethren. I would like us to have a discussion concerning Paul's epistles and the law. Paul is an outstanding apostle whose themes in his writings and are usually prone to misinterpretation by many teachers of the Bible, and as such, his writings are prone to twisting, so that some of the themes in his letters are really misinterpreted. And I'll just want us to look into some of these things that Paul wrote in his letters. There are many writings that Paul writes to the Gentiles mostly, and many people consider Paul's writings and the teachings as opposing the keeping of the laws. There are many themes that Paul addresses, but first of all, for the purposes of introduction, we would like to see the profile of the Apostle Paul. Now, according to Acts 22, verse 3, where Paul is giving his defense, he says, I am verily a man which am a Jew, born in Tarsus, a city in Sicilia, yet brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, and taught according to the perfect manner of the law of the fathers, and was zealous toward Yahweh as you all are this day. That is Paul in Acts 22, verse 3. What we notice there is that Paul is a Jew, born in Tarsus, that is a city in Sicily, and then of course very zealous about the word of Yahweh. Secondly, we notice again something concerning him about what Paul was doing earlier on before he was converted to be an apostle, that is in Acts 9 verse 1 to 2, where it says, and Paul, yet breathing out threatenings and slaughter against the disciples of the Messiah, went unto the high priest. So we are informed here that Paul, or rather Saul, was among those who persecuted the early assembly of Yeshua the Messiah. That is before he was actually converted to be a disciple. And verse 2 says, and he desired of him letters to Damascus, to the synagogues, that if he found any of these way, whether they were men or women, he might bring them bound unto Jerusalem. That is in Acts 9 verse 1 to 2. So this is just a bit of some information concerning who the Apostle Paul is. Before he was converted, he was persecuting the assembly and, desiring letters to take to Damascus, of course, from the leaders, so that he can go and bring those who are worshiping to Jerusalem so that they can be, of course, jailed or judged. While going to Damascus, there is something very dramatic that happened on the way, and that is recorded, that is right in Acts chapter 9, verse 3 to 6. And it says, and as he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly there shined around about him a light from heaven, and he fell to the earth and heard a voice saying unto him, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? And he said, Who art thou, Master? And the Master said, I am Yeshua, whom thou persecutest. It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks. And he, trembling and astonished, said, Master, what wilt thou have me to do? And the Master said unto him, Arise and go into the city, and it shall be told thee what thou must do. Now, this is from verse 3 to 6. This is actually Paul's conversion. As he was going to Damascus, light shines upon him on the way, and then he was traveling with some other people, and they noticed Paul kneeling down and looking up the sky, and then, of course, suddenly when he was left, of course, he had actually lost his sight. That is in verse 9, which says, And he was 3 days without sight, and neither did eat nor drink. So after that, light shining upon him from heaven, Paul actually went blind for 3 days and also did not eat or drink for the 3 days that he was blind. So this is a record of Paul transitioning from a persecutor of the assembly of Yeshua the Messiah to being a disciple. When Paul lost his sight in Damascus, there was a disciple who was actually a disciple of Yeshua who lived in Damascus. And this disciple had actually been given a vision of Paul, coming so that he can help him to restore his sight. That is in, let's check there, right there in Acts chapter 9, verse 12 to 15. Now, about Ananias, and verse 12 says, And hath seen in a vision a man named Ananias coming in and putting his hand on him, that he might receive his sight. Then Ananias answered, Master, I have heard by many of these men how much evil he hath done to thy saints at Jerusalem. And here he hath authority from the chief priest to bind all that call on thy name. Verse 15. But the master said unto him, Go thy way, for he is a chosen vessel unto me to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. Now, this is Ananias given a vision about him restoring sight to Paul. And hearing about Paul, he was very surprised that I've heard about this man, how he is persecuting the saints at Jerusalem, those who are calling upon the name of Yeshua the Messiah. And he wanted to decline, but the master told him that he is a chosen vessel unto me, to bear my name before the Gentiles and the kings and the children of Israel. That is why right there he had to accept. And then verse 17, and Ananias went his way and entered into the house, and putting his hands on him, said, Brother Saul, the Master, even Yeshua, that appeared unto thee in the way as thou camest, hath sent me, that thou mightest receive thy sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit. So, right there, Ananias has restored Paul's sight after he lost it during that conversion. And of course, After, getting back the sight, Paul now becomes a different Paul from the Saul whom we know he was persecuting the assembly, and now to Paul the apostle that we know, whom he writes so many letters, particularly to the Gentiles. Now, in before he goes out to the Gentiles, he speaks before the Israelites. And there are some things that are very important to note here. Just as a primary introduction concerning Paul, he first of all begins his ministry even to the Israelites, because it was said to him that he is a vessel unto the Gentiles and unto all the people and even the children of Israel. So Acts 13 verse, of course, the whole of Acts chapter 13 records Paul doing his first ministry even to the Israelites. And verse 16, that is Acts 13 verse 16, Paul says, then Paul stood up and beckoning with his hand said, Men of Israel, and ye that fear Yahweh, give me audience. When Paul preached to the Israelites, most of them did not believe him. In fact, it is only the Gentiles who actually warmly received his message about Yeshua the Messiah. But majority of the Jews or the Israelites did not believe him. That's why right on Acts 13:42, it says, And when the Jews were gone out of the synagogue, the Gentiles besought that these words might be preached to them the next Sabbath. It is very interesting to see here the difference between the reception of by the Gentiles and the reception by the Jews of Paul's message. The Jews were not happy about Paul's preachings, while the Gentiles were very happy about his preachings and, in fact, wanted to hear it more. I think there is something to note there. This misunderstanding by the Jews of Paul's message is actually a continuation of what they did to Yeshua the Messiah. They did not receive the Master. And in fact, we can say, as the apostles and the disciples are going on with the message, they still do not welcome the message about salvation. And in fact, that is why right there on verse 46, it says, Then Paul and Barnabas waxed bold and said, It was necessary that the word of Yahweh should first have been spoken to you, but seeing you put it from you and judge yourselves unworthy of everlasting law, we turn to the Gentiles. Now, Paul and Barnabas and even all the other apostles took their time to preach to the Jews, but they could not listen. And therefore, Paul is announcing here that we turn to the Gentiles. And that is why it is very important that we had this presentation, just the introduction of it, so that now we see how Paul is addressing the issues about salvation, of course, to the Gentiles. Now, just as we get to Paul going to the Gentiles, because he has been chosen as a vessel to take the name of Yeshua the Messiah to the Gentiles and even to the world. We want to just look at some of the common themes in his letters, of course, to the Gentiles. Paul addresses so many things. Of course, these are just some few. Paul, in his letters, talks about grace. He talks about unity in Messiah, talks about suffering and persecution, talks about law and salvation, talks about faith, talks also about the second advent of the Messiah, and of course, among many other themes that he addresses. Now, in his writings, Paul addresses these issues in wisdom given unto him in a way that many people are likely to misinterpret his writings. My presentation and discussion is to look at how Paul, in his letters to the apostles, addressed the issue of the law. Because indeed, many people believe and even teach that we are no longer under the law, but we are actually saved by the grace alone. That and they actually read some of the Paul's writings to support their teachings, you know, against the keeping of the law. So from this introduction, I would want us to now see how Paul addresses the subject of law, of course, concerning the Gentiles. Now, Peter is a contemporary apostle who actually worked with Paul. And Peter, in his own writing, that is in 2 Peter 3, verse 15 to 16, makes a reference to Paul's writings. And this is what Peter had to say, that an account that the long suffering of our Master is salvation, even as our beloved brother Paul also, according to the wisdom given unto him, hath written unto you, as also in all his epistles, speaking in them of these things, in which are some things hard to be understood, which they that are unlearned and unstable rest, as they do also the other scriptures, unto their own destruction. So Peter notes here that Paul's writings are hard to understand, that there are some things which are hard to be understood. And he also notes here that Paul is writing according to the wisdom given unto him. So that is why, while reading Paul's letters to the Gentiles, we need a very deep and a clear understanding of the matters and the themes that he is addressing, because in them are some things which are hard to be understood. And these things which are hard to be understood, they that are unlearned and unstable rest. That is, those who are not learned, of course, in matters of the Bible, the scriptures, and of course, they that are unstable in faith. Those who do not have, a principle as far as their faith is concerned, they twist these writings. And what happens when they twist the Paul's writings is that they do so unto their own destruction, just as they do also the rest of the scriptures. And that is why, brethren, it is very important that when we read Paul's letters, we really look at the context in which Paul is writing these letters to the Gentiles. Now, Now, in Romans 7, that is chapter 7, verse 1 to 3, Paul writes to the Romans that, Know ye not, brethren, for I speak to them that know the law, that the law hath dominion over a man as long as he liveth. Now, there are some things that we can learn from here. One is that Paul is writing to the people or the assembly or the brethren that know the law. They know the law, of course, probably because they were taught. And this is in reference to the laws of Yahweh. And he says again that the law hath dominion over a man as long as he liveth. So here is Paul writing clearly that as long as one lives, the law hath dominion over him. Now, he goes ahead to give an analogy, a comparison about marriage and the law. In verse 2, he says, "For the woman which hath an husband is bound by the law to her husband so long as he liveth. But if the husband be dead, she is loosed from the law of her husband." Of course, this is making a comparison and using this analogy about marriage to teach about the keeping of the law. That as long as the husband is alive, then the woman, that is the wife, is bound by the laws of the husband. But if the husband is dead, then of course she is actually loosed from the laws of the husband. Now, he goes ahead, verse 3. So then, if while her husband liveth she be married to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if her husband be dead, she is free from that law, so that she is no adulteress, though she be married to another man. Now, here Paul uses an analogy that we understand that if this woman, of course, is married to another man while the husband is, of course, alive, then that one is called adultery. But if the husband is dead and the woman is married to another man, then she is actually free from the law of that dead man, and therefore she is no adulteress. So this is a comparison about the law. And of course, it is a good comparison because as we know about the children of Israel, Yahweh actually refers to them as his own, wife. And that is another comparison made that is in the book of Hosea, which I just want us to look at. That is in Hosea 2:16 to 17, where it says, "In that day declares Yahweh, you will call me my husband. You will no longer call me my master. I will remove the names of the Baals from her lips. No longer will their names be invoked." Now, this is an analogy that can be compared to that one made by Paul in Romans chapter 7. Now, while Yahweh still exists, he says that of course he is like a husband to the children of Israel, that they are his wife. Now, but of course, uh, we have read the story about the Israelites, how they, committed adultery by worshiping and going after the idols of the Gentiles. And that is why the prophet is prophesying a day, which of course will come in future, when the children of Israel will be redeemed. And now in that day, they will call Yahweh my husband. and they will no longer be worshiping the idols. In other words, they will no longer commit adultery. So they will be keeping the laws of Yahweh and Yahweh alone. So this is a very good comparison as far as marriage and the law is concerned. Now back to Romans chapter 7, verse 1 to 3. Now, if the Messiah is still alive, if Yahshua the Messiah is still alive, and of course, if Yahweh is alive, then we are bound by his laws. This is the implication that we get from this context. But of course, if we believe that Yeshua the Messiah is dead, Yahweh forbid, and he did not resurrect, Yahweh forbid, then we are free from keeping his laws. Of course, that is not the case. He is resurrected, and the Father did not die, and that is why we are ever bound to keep his laws. Paul makes a conclusion in verse 12 that wherefore the law is holy, and the commandment holy, and just and good. So here is Paul after giving an analogy about marriage and how the law has dominion over man as long as he lives. He makes somehow, a conclusion in verse 12 that wherefore the law is holy and the commandment holy and just and good. So this is one of the evidence that shows indeed Paul teaches about keeping of the law. Yet another scripture that we want to look at, Romans 2:13. Paul writes again to the Romans that for not the bearers of the law are just before Yahweh, but the doers of the law shall be justified. So Paul here confirms that it is not those who, that is the hearers of the word or of the law, not just those who listen to the law without putting the law into action. If you just listen to the law, you know the law, but you don't do according to the same law, then you are not justified. It is those who do according to the law whom are said to be justified. Still, in Romans still 6:14 to 15, Paul writes again that for sin shall not have dominion over you, for you are not under the law, but under grace. Now, that is why Peter writes about, Paul's letters, that some people can misinterpret or can twist. If we make a comparison about what Paul says in Romans 6:14 and what Paul says in Romans 7 verse 1, somebody can say there is contradiction. But there is no contradiction. Just going back again to Romans 7 verse Romans 7 verse 1. Know ye not, brethren, for I speak to them that know the law, how that the law hath dominion over a man as long as he liveth. Now, making a comparison of this one to the one we have in right in Romans 6:14, that for sin shall not have dominion over you, for you are not under the law, but under grace. Somebody can say it is quite contradictory, but a clean understanding and a very objective understanding and interpretation of this, there is no contradiction here. Now, verse 15 says, what then? Shall we sin because we are not under the law, but under grace? Yahweh forbid. So here, Paul talks about grace and the law. Of course, Paul is emphasizing the fact that even with the keeping of the law, there is still the grace of Yahweh. Because if Yahweh were to, justify us by the keeping of the law, then indeed none could be counted as holy before Yahweh. If we were to be exclusively counted justified by the works of the law, it it has to have the grace of Yahweh, because as human beings we are prone to sinning. We sin before Yahweh. And that is why Paul in verse 15 is not leaving out the aspect about the law. That what then? Shall we sin because we are not under the law, but under grace? Yahweh forbid. So as we know from 1 John chapter 3 verse 4, sin is described as, the transgression of the law. So Paul is addressing the same aspect here, that we cannot, commit sin because we are under grace. He says, Yahweh forbid. So this is another aspect that can be very confusing and challenging to understand, but just need to have a clear understanding and an objective interpretation about this, that you cannot separate law and the grace. If we were to say that we are under the law, that we are saved only by keeping the law, then we are downplaying the role which Yahshua the Messiah played through his shedding of the blood to be saved. We are downplaying him being, slaughtered for our sins, being a ransom for our sins. Now, if we say we are exceptionally under the grace and then we continue to sin, then I think indeed it doesn't go that way. That because of grace, now we can do whatever we want because we have the grace of Yeshua the Messiah. Then we can do whatever we want, not considering the law talks about. For example, that if we are under the law, under grace, then we are free to even steal, we are free to commit murder, you know, we are free to covet, we are free to even worship idols because we are under the grace. So the grace do not do away with the law, not like many people teach out there. To just close on, Paul and the law to the Romans, let us look at Romans 3:31, where Paul writes, do we then make void the law through faith? Yahweh forbid. Yeah, we establish the law. This is Paul confirming that faith again do not do away with the law. We establish the law. And it is very simple here, because in the book of James, the Bible clearly teaches that faith without action is dead, and this action should consequently be measured by the standards of the law. That is why uh, Paul is saying, can we make void the law through faith? And then, of course, say, no, we establish the law. So these are just concerning the letters to the Romans. Now, we want to look at another letter written to, a different, group of the Gentiles, and then we see how Paul is addressing the same issue about the law. The book of Galatians is also another interesting epistle that addresses about the law, where Paul writes to the Galatians, and it is around 45 to 60 CE or before the current era. where Paul addresses the issue of the law in a manner that is not very easy to understand if someone is not very objective. He writes concerning the law, and understanding the context of the Galatians is very important because these are the people who were actually taught by some Pharisaic Jews that they were still to keep the laws of sacrificing animals, and some of the parasitic Jews actually taught them that salvation is earned only through the keeping of the law. That is why Paul had to teach the Galatians that we are not justified by the keeping of the law alone. So because if that were the case, then indeed we could not need a Messiah if we were to be justified by exceptionally the keeping of the law. And that is what Paul is addressing here. So in Galatians 3, verse 5 to 7, let us get what Paul says here, that he therefore that ministered to you the Spirit, and worked miracles among you, doeth he it by the works of the law, or by hearing of faith? Even as Abraham believed Yahweh, and it was accounted to him for righteousness. Know ye therefore that they which are of faith, the same are the children of Abraham. Now, Paul here writes that, the one that ministered to you, the Spirit, worked miracles among you. Does he do the works by the law or by hearing of faith? Somebody may interpret here to mean that Paul is downplaying the role of the law in salvation. It is not the case here, because we cannot separate, just as we also read previously, that we cannot make the law to be void because of faith. No, we establish the law. Now, in fact, talking about Abraham, what we know about Abraham is that he believed, yes, and he was accounted for him righteousness. Now, just referring to this patriarch, that is Abraham, that is in Genesis 26, verse 5. About Abraham, it is said, because that Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my church and my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. So this is the same Abraham that, Paul is talking about in Galatians, and we are told here that he obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. So, right here, Paul is referring to the same Abraham. So, we know therefore that um, faith alone cannot do away with the importance of keeping the law, not like many of the people would like to teach. Now, still, the book of Galatians, going on with the same reading, that is in verse 13, Paul says, Yeshua hath redeemed us from the curse of the law, being made a curse for us, for it is written, Cursed is everyone that hanged on a tree. Wherefore then served the law? It was added because of transgression, till the seed should come, to whom the promise was made, and it was ordained by angels in the hand of a mediator. Is the law then against the promises of Yahweh? Yahweh forbid. For if there had been a law given which could have given life, verily righteousness should have been by the law. Now, what Paul is teaching here is that Yeshua became a curse for us. That is, he redeemed us from the curse of the law. How? Yeshua is the one who is actually, bringing us the grace. it is not that when we keep the law, we are justified by it alone. Keeping the law without Yeshua cannot earn us salvation. And of course, we cannot claim to be, believing in Yeshua again without keeping the law. The two cannot be separated. Now, concerning this, wherefore then serve the law? It was added because of transgressions, till the seed should come to whom the promise was made. Now, of course, here, uh, Paul is talking about the law being added because of transgressions. And let us remember here that Paul is addressing Galatians. And the law that was added because of the transgressions is the law concerning the sacrificing of the animals. That it was added because of transgression. But when Yeshua came, he actually did away with the sacrificing of the animals for the forgiveness of sin. It says here that it was added because of transgressions, till the seed shall come, to whom the promise was made. So here, just as I introduced here, I said Paul was teaching the Galatians about we are no longer supposed to be offering animals. Why? Because the same was added because of transgressions, and therefore they had to be doing it annually for the cleansing of their sins. But when Yeshua came, he became the final ransom for our sins. He was slaughtered, and of course, he shed his blood for us. And that is why we no longer need to be sacrificing animals for the forgiveness of sins, for the cleansings of sin. And that is what, again, Hebrews 10:1 talks about, that previously in the first covenant, the priest had to be offering, animal sacrifices year in, year out, because the same could not completely clean one from sin. But once Yeshua came, the animal offering for the cleansing of sin ended because he became our lamb for the sin. That is, his blood became, cleanse us once and for all once we accept. Now, in this case, Paul is addressing again Galatians to just not look at the law alone. No, but to also consider about the grace and how that law was added. And here he makes it very clear that is the law then against the promises of Yahweh? And then he says, Yahweh forbid. So I think here Paul had a very difficult task to do, teaching people about how part of the law was fulfilled, and again having them to know that the same law, is not against the promises of Yahweh. So he had a very difficult task to balance between teaching on the side of the law that has been fulfilled by Yeshua the Messiah, which is actually the seed, and then of course the keeping of the laws which have not been fulfilled. So it was not a very easy task for the apostle here. So, as we have concluded here, that indeed Paul had, some hard task, especially concerning the Galatians, because these are the Gentiles, and there were some Jews who had actually infiltrated into the ministry, and they were teaching the Galatians that they had to, go on sacrificing, offering animals. Well, this is in fact what is even going on right now about the Jews. Some and majority of them are still going on with animal sacrifices because they did not know the Messiah. Now, still going on, that is Galatians 3 verse 24 and 25, Paul says, "Wherefore the law was our schoolmaster to bring us unto the Messiah, that we might be justified by faith." So here he makes a connection between the law and faith, that the law became our schoolmaster. The law became a teacher, that is to bring us unto the Messiah, that we might be justified by faith. Faith in Yeshua the Messiah is measured by looking at the way we behave and by looking at our actions against the standards of the law. Now, but after that, faith is come, we are no longer under a schoolmaster or, of course, the law. This means that once we have faith in Yeshua the Messiah, we are like free from the law. We are not bound by the law. We are not judged by the law. We are like free to the law when we are obedient with the law. That is a very a very clear understanding from this context about Galatians. So Paul, from what we have seen in many of his writings, we've only looked at just a few, that is Romans and in fact Galatians. But from his writings and the verses that we have read, indeed, there is no evidence that Paul is teaching about not keeping the law. But we have also seen and acknowledged, just as Peter did, that his writings can somehow be misinterpreted to mean that Paul is teaching against the law. But Paul faced several challenges just from the moment he was, converted to become a disciple, to become an apostle. And in fact, as I conclude this presentation right here, Paul was taken before a council in Jerusalem to be judged, because the Jews were not happy about the way he was preaching, the way people were getting to listen to him, and particularly the Gentiles around. So they were not happy, and that is why they wanted to jail him. So they brought him before a council, and very important is what Paul says in his defense before the council. That is in Acts 24:14. Paul says, "But this I confess unto thee, that after the way which they call heresy, so worship I the Elohim of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets." Now, this is Paul making his defense before the council. Of course, he was accused of, making a blasphemy to the temple, talking about Moses in a bad way. So they look for all the accusations to heap on him. But in his defense, he says, "But this I confess unto thee, that after the way which they call heresy, so worship I the Elohim of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets." So this makes it a conclusion that indeed Paul believed in all things and even taught about the keeping of the law. Shalom.